The era of austerity is finally coming to an end, announced Philip Hammond in his budget speech to the House of Commons yesterday. Well, it certainly seemed like it, judging by the Chancellor's policy announcements, which included a slew of new spending commitments, all with very little detail on how any of it was to be funded. There were pledges of more than £20 billion in additional funding for the NHS by 2023, an extra £779 million for social care, £1 billion for the armed forces, and £675 million for a future high streets fund, to name but a few. But with UK debt still approaching 88%, the highest level since 1966, is it fair or just to turn on the spending taps and ask the next generation to carry the burden and eventually foot the bill? So was this a Halloween budget full of taxation tricks and unfunded treats? Joining me to give their take on yesterday's budget policy changes and spending commitments is Mark Littlewood, Director General at the IEA, and Kate Andrews, Associate Director at the IEA. For more podcasts, films and reports, head over to our website at iea.org.uk. After watching the two of you hit the TV studios last night to give instant reaction to the budget, I already know, broadly, what you're both going to say in this podcast. So I want to open by asking the two of you to tell our listeners what you actually liked about the budget. So I'll start with you, Kate.
I think Mark's going to disagree with me here, but I liked that the Chancellor brought forward the increases to the tax thresholds. 32 million people will experience mid-next year some form of a tax cut. Their pocketbooks will be slightly better off. Both in the lowest bracket, the raise of the personal allowance means that people at the bottom end of the pay spectrum are going to have access to more cash. And, you know, across the board, I think that that benefit will be felt. So we'll give the Chancellor one cheer for that.
Mark?
I don't really disagree with that. I think it's good to raise the income tax thresholds, but it's a bit like bringing Christmas forward from December the 25th to November the 25th. I mean, there's a certain sleight of hand here, especially as he's indicating those thresholds are not just going to be on a trajectory upwards. So really the gain is going to be a bit of a windfall rather than a continual year-on-year tax break if wages continue to rise. Look, there were a few other bits as well. He's frozen fuel duty, but I think that's now just penned into every budget statement for the 9th year in a row.
Yeah, it's almost a decade, isn't it?
He's I can't remember if it was frozen or a cut on beer and cider. There's a little bit of business tax rate relief, although a rather fiddly way of dealing with it. There's a little bit of relief on stamp duty, again fiddly, dealing with exemptions and carve-outs. So there are some tax cuts. So I'd give him a bit of a Halloween cheer for that.
I like one more thing. I think it's very positive that while the Chancellor is committing a lot of money to the NHS that has not obviously been funded yet, that he has recognized that mental health care is significantly underfunded, and taking the first steps to acknowledge that that needs to be addressed amongst young people in particular is positive. Not thrilled that he hasn't laid out how he's costing it, how he's budgeting it, but if we're going to allow him to virtue signal a little bit, this was in the right area. We've been ignoring the issue of mental health for far too long, giving lip service to the idea that it's just as important to tackle as physical ailments and yet not doing anything about it. So as long as we have the bureaucratic, patient forgetting NHS, let it at least acknowledge that mental health care is something that has to be tackled.
Well, go on then. We might as well go straight on to the NHS.
Great.
£20 billion in additional annual funding, an extra £779 million for social care. No idea how we're funding it.
So the Chancellor has suggested that all will be revealed next year, a combination of a government spending review, which is welcome to actually look at how huge state programs are funded, but also that the NHS will be unveiling a 10-year strategy to show how the increased funds of $20 billion per year by 2023 will be going to the front line to patient care as opposed to into the bureaucracy of it. So look, we could sit here and pretend to be hopeful. We could pretend that next year we're going to see the huge reforms that are needed to make the NHS fit for the 21st century. See reforms that means that the money goes from the state to the patient, as opposed to, as Mark says, being centrally planned for them. I'm not hopeful in the slightest. None of the rhetoric around the NHS's 70th birthday suggested that politicians are ready to face the facts about the National Health Service.
So isn't cash just useless then without meaningful reform?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's useless. Any huge injection of cash in the short term is going to have some kind of positive benefit, right? It is truly a Band-Aid trying to fix a wound. So it's not to say that there won't be any benefit. The problem is that when you're injecting that level of cash and when taxpayers are having to stump up that kind of bill for just minimal change and also just in the short term, nothing that we can really see improve down the road, well, it's not useless, but it's pretty darn close.
And Mark, whilst the government has reduced the deficit, the debt has continued to climb in cash terms. And now that's not just bad news for young people like me and Kate. It could be a disaster for everyone. If a recession hit and the Chancellor had increasingly limited room for manoeuvre, why do you think the government has stopped advancing the moral case for potentially ruinous debt?
Yeah, I mean, the problem's this, isn't it? I think that essentially, right back in 2010, when the Conservatives came to power in a coalition government, they talked amazingly tough. We're going to go through every government department with a tooth comb. This is almost a national emergency. The position is far worse than we believed it was during the election campaign. Immediate surgery now. So they talked incredibly tough. George Osborne continued to talk incredibly tough, but they didn't act tough. They talked dry and acted wet. Probably exactly the wrong way to approach politics. Probably do it the other way round. So I think they've basically just sort of run out of any sort of energy to deal with this. The best way to deal with a serious problem in the public finances, which we had in the wake of the financial crash, is you do it fast and painfully. In a year or two. I think the Republic of Ireland, when they hit the buffers, slashed public sector pay by 15% in one go. What we decided to do was actually go on a sort of long, rather tedious and painful course of therapy over 8 years or so, which we still sort of haven't completed, but we've just got bored of. So really, the Conservatives have now defaulted, the government has defaulted to saying that continual budget deficits of £20 billion per annum or so are the new normal, and we're not really going to bother tidying up that last bit of the budget deficit. To your point, Darren, there are the risk here. Look, again, if we're looking to give the government some credit in the budget, they have more or less eliminated the budget deficit. I mean, they've got rid of the overwhelming bulk of it. But the problem is this, that we keep, or we used to hear from the previous Chancellor, the old motto of we need to, mend the roof while the sun is shining. In fact, there's no sign of doing this at all. We're sort of hoping for more sunshine tomorrow, next week and next year. Now, there may well be sunshine next week, next year, next month. I don't know. I'm not saying that's implausible. But there is certainly no plan B for rain. And that is the problem. If the economic forecasts turn out to be wrong, and they often are, if they turn out to be too optimistic, and they well could be, then that hole in the public finances grows. We have not cracked that problem.
I think Mark makes the important point that for all the talk of George Osborne self-promoting himself as the austerity chancellor, real spending over the coalition government was only cut 0.5% per annum in real terms. And so the British public believes that it has gone through this very painful period of austerity. And yet, actually, the tough decisions were never really made. Now, credit where credit is due to those who have been complaining, the cuts were disproportionate. If you were a young person, if you were on benefits, you felt the cuts more strongly than a pensioner, someone who actually tended to be wealthier than the other two groups I just mentioned. So it isn't that there haven't been any cuts, there have been, but they were disproportionate and they were smaller than the government talked them up to be. And I think, a lot of people have called this a holding budget around Brexit. I'm sure we'll come back to Brexit. But actually, I think it's quite an important moment, whether it turns out to be a holding budget or not. The Conservatives have basically abandoned their desire to eliminate the deficit. Labour's had quite a big win over the past few days because the conversation is no longer who is going to be financially responsible. It's who's going to be a bit less bad when it comes to borrowing, when it comes to spending.
I wrote down this morning going through my notes, the strategic error of this budget might be its implication, and Tim Stanley wrote this very well, might be the implication that what we all wanted out of 8 years of Tory penny pinching was to be able to afford to return to socialism as soon as humanly possible. That's the implication of this budget, isn't it?
That is well said by Tim Stanley. Well, it's essentially saying it's backing up Labour's narrative that austerity was a choice. When it's convenient for the Conservatives to spend, they start spending, even when the deficit hasn't been eliminated. And that really is backing up a lot of Labour's claims. Now, it's terrible economics, and as Mark points out, if things turn sour, if the economy dips, and let's be honest, whether you believe the forecast or not, growth's not looking fantastic. It's actually very stagnant. If things get slightly worse, the UK is in a terrible position to be able to handle that now. Very little, I think, has been done to address that in these past few years under the Conservative government, and they've just fed right into Labour's rhetoric.
There's two different things going on here, aren't there? We've touched on fiscal responsibility, yes or no. And just to be clear on that, I mean, the government's numbers here are not totally reckless, right? I mean, it's not as if the budget deficit is sort of spiralling away back up to 160 billion or whatever it was. I mean, it is down and under control. It's not, for fiscal hawks like me, hasn't been finally dealt with, but they've got it under some sort of control. This isn't a totally reckless spending spree that they've been going on. But there are two different things. One, are you being fiscally responsible? And the second is, to the extent that you're not, where are the giveaways? And the oddity here from a Conservative government is all of the giveaways are on public spending. I mean, you could be very fiscally irresponsible. You could say, I don't care if the budget deficit is £200 billion this year, because we're going to abolish income tax and slash this tax, and that's going to give a big boom to the economy. But the Conservatives now seem to be caught into this idea that the only fiscal stimulus that counts is government spending, whereas you can also have a fiscal stimulus that's a tax cut.
Well, that's actually what Donald Trump's done, isn't it? He's been quite fiscally irresponsible. He is racking up the deficit in order to pay for his tax cuts, but that was the kind of giveaway that he wanted to dish out. And Mark, I agree with you. It's not as if we can point at the Conservatives and say, how could you conceive of this? This is full-blown socialism. Obviously, it's not, but this was essentially the only major party in UK politics that was at least paying lip service to the idea that you want to balance the books in the best way you can. And with £25 billion still as the standout for the deficit, if that is the new normal, as you said before, much of my criticism isn't necessarily that their giveaway to social care or to education is particularly the problem. But they've now set that red line in the sand at $25 billion, and it enables all the other parties essentially to say, well, look, if the Conservatives don't think balancing the books matters, why should we?
Look, I agree with that. I mean, the truth of it is, if you get into the slightly more complex economics of it, and this goes to my other criticism of the way the Conservatives have handled the economy, you can actually run deficits ad infinitum. As long as you are very confident that there is going to be economic growth and potentially meaningful economic growth. I mean, again, if you were to put it on a micro level, if we all knew for certainty that our salary was going to go up 20% every year forever, then you wouldn't worry too much about your Barclaycard bill going up this year, because in 5 years' time you'll easily be able to clear it.
I'd be very nice to you, Mark. Put it that way.
Don't be too hopeful, guys. So growth is really the way that you crack this. And if you are very confident of growth, because obviously the difference with a government compared to an individual in the labour market is that sort of governments go on forever, whereas individuals over their lifetime, their earnings peak and then drop off, and then they retire and need to spend. But potentially the UK economy, you could sort of put it, if you were optimistic, on a glide path of, let's say, 3% growth per annum forevermore, if you got the right policies. And the compound effects of that are huge. That doubles your GDP in a generation. So my disappointment here, because I think this could be a way round of, if you like, cracking this residual deficit problem, which again, I don't want to overstate, it's there, but it's not colossal, is why on earth does Chancellor after Chancellor treat economic growth figures as some sort of God-given exogenous number, sort of handed down as if it's a matter of nature or science what growth in the economy is going to be, when there is a huge array of things that governments can do to facilitate growth. Tax cuts being one, a lot of supply side reform, a lot of deregulation. These things would supercharge growth. So if you actually had a strategy to say, look, really our target, we can't control all of it. It's not just a question of hitting the right buttons in Whitehall. We can't control all of it. But our underlying aim is to get growth to a consistent 3% rather than the 1.5% per annum it is. And to that end, sort of every government proposal, every civil service proposal is going to have a kind of growth test. Does this assist, do we think, economic growth, or does it dampen it? Whatever else its merits might be. You did that and got growth back up to 3%. Frankly, these problems pretty much disappear. They're certainly very, very heavily mitigated. So at some point, I want people to start talking about economic growth, not just how you balance off the relatively small amount of money that's there, or the smaller amount compared to if we had proper growth in the economy.
Because you do write about that, Mark, in the Times this morning. You ask, we should be asking ourselves, how is it that the US is growing at about 3 times the speed of Britain? Sadly, yesterday's budget did not come close to even addressing this sort of question. Do you think it's those sort of reforms that you've just mentioned? Going back to Kate's point, though, that is something that will be throwing back at you, isn't it? That America have actually been pretty irresponsible when it comes to public spending.
No, that's true. And in fact, in a television interview last night, my opposite number at the Resolution Foundation sort of said it's easy to explain what's happened in America. It's just a massive fiscal stimulus. I don't think that is the whole truth of it, actually. Some of it is that.
There's been a lot of deregulation.
But there has been, exactly. There has been a lot of deregulation. By and large, I don't have the figures to hand, but sort of business confidence is up. They're sort of, I'm actually, was thinking about whether to double down and invest in this company or my company or set up a business. The sort of confidence around that in the States is a lot higher now, and I think will be retained for the next 5 years. That's a recipe for growth. Now, the fiscal irresponsibility side, I hear that, and I am quite hawkish and want to balance the books, and to that end, I wouldn't just give away tax cuts. But if I had a certain amount of money to give away, I think I would do more of it in tax cuts and less of it in public spending. Again, the Resolution Foundation last night was suggesting to me, and I have no reason to doubt their figures, but they are their figures, that for each pound that Philip Hammond sort of found down the back of a sofa because the economic forecast and the tax revenues are better, he has spent 97p on enhanced public spending, 3p on tax cuts, and 0p on reducing the deficit. I mean, surely a balanced approach to the economy, which is what they claim, might be a sort of a third. We're going to use 33p to cut the deficit, 33p on tax cuts and 33% on enhanced spending. But they've gone the full-blown splurge on spending route.
And it looks, in my opinion, a bit desperate politically speaking, that they think that the electorate cares most about handouts. And this is odd to me because David Cameron, surprisingly won that 2015 election. It was a small majority, albeit, but it was a majority for the Conservatives based on that platform of, he was using the term austerity at the time, but based on this platform that we have to be responsible with the way that we spend, that we're not going to give these handouts.
Well, exactly. Ed Miliband lost that election as soon as he said Labour did not spend recklessly.
I think there is appetite from the public to feel like what they're earning is actually going to be protected, that it's not going to be taken away, that their taxes aren't going to be increased. I think that kind of thing matters very much. And to go back to the States very quickly, one of the major differences, I think, between what's happening in the US and the UK is that in the US, it's not simply the regulations that are changing and the tax codes that are changing, but the attitudes are changing. Regulators have been instructed to work with business. Don't try to find them and punish them and seek them out to destroy them. Work with them to make sure they're compliant. Work with them to figure out which regulations aren't working for them.
Kate, you mentioned corporation tax. The Chancellor didn't, not once. So I wonder, do you reckon that this is because in Philip Hammond's mind, he can see politics going in one direction, and that direction is downhill and to the left?
I can't pretend to know what's going on in Philip Hammond's mind, but I suspect there are multiple reasons it didn't come up. The fact that it didn't come up should make us assume that it's still on track to be lowered from 19% to 17%.
And I can't get into the Chancellor's mind.
If only.
But if you were sort of trying to read the body language and the nudges and the winks, it seems to be that what he's saying is, if Brexit goes badly, either, I don't know, there's no deal or there's no deal and the markets react terribly or whatever, then we've got to have in our top pocket a kind of list of measures that we'll implement in order to ensure that we sail more smoothly onwards. And the sort of remedies and medicines we could apply might be substantial reductions in corporation tax over and beyond the downwards drift at the moment. Major reductions in income tax, I don't know. Huge programme of deregulation. Massive planning reform. These are the sort of things we'll do if we really get into a hole. But if those are good things, why not do them anyway? I mean, you don't need to hold back your best cards for the trickiest hand of poker. You can play your best cards when you've got them in the top of your pocket. So it seems very strange to me that the indication, at least, he hasn't enunciated this, the government, but the indication seems to be, if we get into a hole and Brexit goes badly and we, quote, crash out without a deal, then we'll start doing all these wonderful things. Just do these wonderful things anyway.
Now, if this was an almost Halloween budget of taxation tricks and unfunded treats, the ultimate taxation trick would have been the UK's digital services tax. Now, the Chancellor insists, Kate, that this will not hit consumers. But I'm pretty sure this is one area that we will all agree on. Like all taxes, it will hit consumers. The goal is clearly to make shopping online more expensive while making retail, local retail, a little more attractive. But is that really the right choice?
Oh, it's certainly not the right choice. The answer to the high street crisis is innovation. It's not to try to stifle the direction that we've all been moving in. Really remarkable when you compare the giveaways that the Chancellor has dished out to different sectors. The Future High Streets Fund is almost £700 million. The extra for social care is £800 million. I mean, talk about priorities. He's giving slightly more to aid social care, where, you know, an area that I think, regardless of whether you're a free marketeer or socialist, we recognize this chronically underfunded and needs to be addressed in some way. And he's treating the high street as if it's almost the same. I think that perspective is very backwards thinking. And to bring in a digital services tax in many ways is simply acknowledging that corporation tax is not fit for purpose, which they're still refusing to reform. But it is a total misunderstanding about where taxes fall. Corporation tax falls in quite a big bulk on workers. It comes out of workers' wages, and a digital services tax is inevitably going to fall on consumers. And over the past few years, when you look at what this government is bringing in terms of tax, they've already done this with the sugar tax, and we've already seen it fall on consumers. I mean, there's evidence for this. It's not a hard thing to understand. And the Chancellor's wording was very interesting, because he actually said in his speech yesterday that it was not the intention for this tax to fall on consumers. But he didn't rule it out altogether, because he's a smart man and he knows that it will.
Well, Mark, one key advantage of Amazon's business model is its lack of physical presence, because it allows them to bypass many of the costs associated with a brick and mortar store. Sure. Is this an unfair advantage?
Well, not per se, but blimey, the longer this interview goes on, the more I'm feeling sorry for Philip Hammond and a bit of an apologist for this government.
Someone's got to do
it. There was a curiosity that, again, in the narrative, that we're going to make Britain fit for the future and the modern world and the sort of high-tech revolution. And the way we're going to do that is to make it easier to run a butcher, a baker or a candlestick maker on your high street, and rather more difficult to run a major global digital tech company. The challenge in terms of tax policy that these digital companies bring with them is that back in the day, your sort of geographical location and the office or the retail premises you operated from gave a very good fix on what you were doing, what your turnover was, what the rateable value of that property was. If you had a colossal retail premises on King's Road, we were going to tax you more than if you got a very small shop in the middle of nowhere in some backwater. Digital companies drive a coach and horses through that. So a case can be made whatever you think of it being easier and nicer and cheaper and quicker to buy from Amazon rather than your village bookstore, is the tax system at present discriminating against the village bookstore? Is it actually, if you like, unnecessarily hastening what you might consider to be the ultimate death of the village bookstore? And I would argue it is, because these digital tech companies, in virtue of them being, I don't believe there's anything nefarious about it, but in virtue of it being hard to pin down exactly where are you and exactly what business are you doing in each jurisdiction, makes it very hard to tax them. If they are... the tax he's brought in is complicated, fiddly and small, it has to be said. £400 million a year is hardly transformative.
But, doesn't fund the High Street Fund.
Yeah, but no, that's true. But I don't know whether it would fall on consumers. That's what standard economic logic would say, and I do get frustrated when politicians talk about taxing corporations and businesses. Yeah, I mean, the only thing you can tax is human beings. Yes. There's nobody else to pay the tax. You can't just tax a name in a FTSE 100 list. You can send them the bill, but ultimately it will be recouped from a range of actual living, breathing human beings. But it doesn't necessarily mean it will fall entirely on the consumers. I mean, it's possible, if you believe Google and Amazon at the moment are profiting, perfectly legally, but nevertheless profiting and doing well because of their unusual tax position, that might well be reflected in the salary of Google and Amazon employees. It will certainly be reflected in the dividends on the share price if they're making huge profits. And it's conceivable, if a tax is imposed on them and those profits come down, that the pinch is felt by the workforce of these companies or the shareholders of those companies, who then get lower dividends, rather than it necessarily being the case that it's an extra £1 every time you buy a Blu-ray or a book from Amazon.
No, Mark, you're right about that, and we can't be certain where the full cost will fall. I think, if we look at things like the sugar tax, companies will pass it on to the consumer if they think they can, and people will keep buying their products. But you're completely right about the workforce. The Adam Smith Institute had a paper about corporation tax several years ago when I worked there, and it estimated that over 50% of corporation tax actually falls on the workforce. But of course, when we think about Amazon or Google, we think about the CEOs and these billionaires, but a lot of these people are receptionists. A lot of these people, are just starting out. A lot of these people are on perfectly normal salaries and will feel that impact. So you're right to say it may not totally fall on the consumer, although I do think in this case a portion of it will. But the other people it falls on are not the people that the Chancellor is pretending it's going to tackle. They're people like you and me who are just trying to make a living as well.
But the important... God, I'm getting more and more left wing as the further this...
This is great, and it's being recorded too.
I mean, at the moment, if you go into your village bookstore and you buy a book, part of that price will reflect the bricks and mortar business rates that bookstore needs to fall. So, sort of noting... I think possibly slightly inaccurately, but in my view rather trivially, that the tax is passed on to consumers is not a reason to be against any form of tax. At the moment, the taxes imposed on bricks and mortars bookstores are passed on to the people who go and shop there. Whereas because, if you like, limited taxes applies to Amazon, there isn't a pass-through. So why should I face, if you like, a higher price by going and buying a book from Waterstones because they are paying business rates than by buying one from Amazon because they are not paying corporation tax?
This is so lefty. I mean, you don't have to go into the bookshop. A lot of people like to. A lot of people actually like to go into stores and shop and will recognize that they're paying a higher cost to do that. But one of the reasons that Amazon and eBay and all these companies have been so successful is because a lot of people like the cheaper cost to get around not having to go to the shop, or might like to go to the shop but will prefer the cheaper cost. You as a consumer get to pick. So to say, well, why do I have to pay more here as opposed to here? I mean... No,
that's not quite right. That's not quite right. I agree that broadly speaking, from what I can understand of it, Amazon's business model is, rather than having prime real estate premises on the high street, we'll have huge warehouses in very cheap land and an extremely efficient postal delivery service to bring it straight to your door. So you can decide what you want to read and it will be on your doormat by that evening. That's principally its competitive business model against the high street. Fine. If that then knocks out every single bookstore in the country, fine by me. However, the rider is, I don't want a distortive tax system that either accelerates or decelerates that process.
Sure.
So at the moment, if it is the case that the government were saying we're going to impose a £1 million tax on every bookstore in the country, well, you could sort of say, well, it's up to consumers whether they go to bookstores in the country or shop on Amazon. Well, yeah, it is to an extent, but the government tax system would have distorted that choice. And at the moment, there is a case that bricks and mortar companies are facing a tax bill that is out of kilter with digital companies. I don't have the solution to that, but I'm just saying I think it's a reasonable dilemma to look at, because obviously I want low taxes and low prices, but I don't want the government taxing method X of providing a good or service in a much higher or different way to method Y of providing the same good or service, and then just saying, well, it's up to the consumers to pick. The consumers would be picking in a very distorted marketplace.
Well, absolutely, and we want the state to get out of distorting the marketplace whenever possible, but surely we would agree that the broad solution to this is to give relief to the high street and to give tax breaks to the high street, rather than to up the tax on online companies who have figured out a cheaper way to get goods to people.
That market distortion rather than creating a
new one. Yeah.
Well, that might be right. I mean, you're obviously here dealing with. I mean, I was trying to apply some second best scenarios. I mean, you might actually say, as your first best solution, you don't believe there should be any tax on business activity whatsoever, right? That we will just apply, income tax, VAT, and land value tax, corporation tax goes, business rates go. Etc., etc. Now, that would be fine if in your absolutely sort of optimal dream utopian budget. But in the absence of that, if you're trying to balance off how the present tax regime applies, I think there is a case that all the nature of things and the trajectory of things is that sort of digital will replace bricks and mortar retail. I don't want a tax system that accelerates that. And it's reasonable that the proportionate burden on Amazon's sale of books to me, you or Darren is essentially the same as the burden on Waterstone's bricks and mortar sale of books to you and Darren. The tax burden.
I just fundamentally disagree. If the government's making it harder for the high street to sell books, then we need to deal with that distortion. But I just can't see a circumstance, especially with a tax code as complex as it is, with the Chancellor essentially in all, he won't actually come out and say it, but through his other policies is recognizing that corporation tax is severely out of date. Why we are complicating this further, why we are increasing the tax burden as opposed to trying to roll it back, it's just something I can't get my head around. I agree with you that if the government policy, whether that be tax or regulation or something else, is totally distorting the market, then it's not free, fair, and competitive, and we can't just look at where consumers are choosing to go. But, when we talk about these digital tech companies, this has been a real revolution, a paradigm shift in the way that we shop, and I highly doubt we're going back to the older days of just going down to your high street to get everything you need. And the Chancellor needs to be on board with that. If you look at his rhetoric, or Ruth Davison's rhetoric leading up to this budget, the reason they feel so passionately about a digital services tax is because they want to protect the high street. This is coming from, I think, a very concerning place.
I'm not suggesting I agree with them on motive. And I'm also not suggesting that in a genuinely liberated economy with no distortive taxes, the high street would suddenly launch a massive fight back against Amazon. I think the direction of travel is quite clear. And by the way, it's not just a sort of high street against Amazon, it's high street against more US-style out-of-town shopping centres and those sort of things, destination shopping. So I'm not trying to get in the way of the market. But short of abolishing business rates entirely, which I'm probably in favour of, but short of that, if you apply business rates, then you probably do have a tax distortion in favour of Amazon and against high street stores. Now, the solution is probably abolish business rates. But if that solution is out of reach, then what's your second best solution?
I don't think anyone listening to this podcast would have expected the two of you to disagree over a digital services.
I don't like the way he's framed this tax, and I'm not in favour of this tax, to be clear.
Yeah.
But I genuinely think he's got a dilemma here.
So abolish business rates. I think that's what
I think that's a conclusion. Yeah. And speaking of conclusion, I concluded this budget by calling it an almost Halloween budget full of taxation tricks and unfunded treats. Now, I'm wondering if the two of you can, in a sentence, conclude the budget. Mark?
Well, I don't have the same poetic flourish that you've got there, Darren. But I think it was unimaginative, Lots of small gimmicks. I've also suggested in my column that the Chancellor should be obliged, when he's talking about spending, to round to the nearest £1 billion. It is a farce that you've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer standing up for the most important annual fiscal statement, and he starts announcing he's going to spend £1.7 million on Holocaust education. I mean, that might be a good thing to do, but the idea that that features in a budget statement when your overall budget is north of £800 billion is ridiculous. It would be like me going to the IEA board and boasting that I had saved 2p on toilet paper or something. So there's lots of fiddly, useless giveaway bits on this. Small sweets, you might say, to use the Halloween theme. I'm not catastrophically worried about it being unfunded. We did touch on, that this is all just sort of totally turning on the taps and we're going to flood the bathroom. It's not quite as hawkish as I would like on the budget deficit side. But the biggest problem is this. It's giving away sweets in the public sector and continuing to charge the private sector for them. So the giveaways are pretty much all on the public spending side and not on the tax cut side. So it's a treat if you work in the public sector, a trick if you work in the private sector.
I like that a lot. Well done. See, that was pretty poetic. Kate?
I'm trying to come up with a Halloween metaphor. I'm not sure I have one. But I think to many it will look like a slightly more generous budget than what the Conservatives have handed out in some time. But I think it's actually much more serious than that. The Conservatives have now abandoned this idea that balancing the books matters. And I think they've given a lot of justification to people who've been arguing for the past 8 to 10 years that it doesn't. And this is the new shift. There is now no political party that would prioritize this. And insert Halloween metaphor here.
Brilliant stuff. Right. Kate Andrews, Associate Director at the IEA, and Mark Littlewood, Director General at the IEA. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our iTunes channel, IEA Conversations.